Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep on a topic that sadly is still making headlines today, redlining. We've got some recent articles and a few legal summaries to dig into. I think you'll find some of this pretty eye-opening, even if you think you already know the basics. Ready to uncover how this historical practice is still shaping our cities and, wealth distribution.
Absolutely. It's amazing how deeply redlining is woven into the fabric of our communities. It's not just about housing. It's about opportunity and access and the very structure of our society, really.
Okay, so for anyone who might need like a quick refresher, let's start with the basics. What exactly is redlining and why should we care about it in like today's world?
Well, at its core, redlining is the systematic denial of financial services. Things like mortgages, loans to people based on where they live, not on their creditworthiness. Imagine a city map with neighborhoods literally outlined in red. Those were the areas that lenders deemed too risky for investment. But the risk wasn't based on financial factors. It was based solely on the racial and ethnic makeup of the residents.
So basically, these financial institutions were drawing these red lines, and entire communities were being shut out just because of their race or ethnicity.
Precisely. And the effects of those decisions are still felt today in so many ways. Think about it. Homeownership is often the biggest driver of wealth creation for families. When you deny that opportunity to entire communities, you create this massive self-perpetuating gap in wealth and resources.
Like they were intentionally building barriers to success.
Yeah, and it wasn't just limited to mortgages either. This lack of investment extended to everything. Businesses, schools, infrastructure, even healthcare access. Redline communities were systematically starved of resources, and that created a vicious cycle that's incredibly difficult to break.
That's really disturbing. I can see how something like this would continue to affect those communities for generations. But it is illegal now, right? So are we just dealing with the ghost of redlining? Or is this something that's still happening maybe in new forms?
Well, it's more complex than just a ghost. While overt redlining is illegal, some experts argue that it's morphed into more subtle practices. For example, there's growing concern about something called reverse redlining, where certain communities are actually targeted with predatory lending practices and high-cost financial products that can trap people in debt.
Hold on, reverse redlining. So you're saying instead of denying loans, some lenders are now exploiting these same communities with loans that are designed to extract wealth.
It's a complicated issue, but yes. Some studies suggest that certain types of loans with high fees and confusing terms are disproportionately marketed in communities of color. It's like a new form of financial exploitation that preys on the same vulnerabilities created by historical redlining.
That is really troubling. So even though we have laws in place, the fight against redlining is far from over. But what exactly are those laws? What safeguards exist to protect people from these discriminatory practices?
Well, there are a few key pieces of legislation that have been instrumental in combating redlining. One of the most important is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made it illegal to discriminate in housing based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was a landmark achievement in the fight for equal housing opportunities.
So that means landlords can't refuse to rent to someone, and banks can't deny a loan based on those protected characteristics.
Exactly. But legal protections go beyond just preventing outright discrimination. The Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, passed in 1977, requires banks to meet the credit needs of all the communities they serve, including low and moderate income neighborhoods.
So it's not enough to just avoid discrimination. Banks are actually required to show that they're actively investing in diverse communities. That's amazing.
It's a powerful tool for promoting equitable lending practices. And there are a couple of other key pieces of legislation you should know about. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, passed in 1975, requires lenders to report data on their lending practices, which makes it possible to identify discriminatory patterns.
Transparency is key. It's like shining a light on those hidden corners where discrimination can fester.
Exactly. And finally, we have the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which established the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB. The CFPB plays a crucial role in enforcing fair lending laws and holding financial institutions accountable.
So it's like having a watchdog specifically tasked with protecting consumers from predatory lending and other shady practices.
Precisely. These laws and agencies provide a framework for combating redlining and promoting a fairer financial system, but the fight continues.
That's a good point. Laws are only as good as their enforcement. And as we've been discussing, redlining is a complex issue that requires constant vigilance. Speaking of vigilance, I think it's time to delve into some historical examples that really illustrate the impact of this practice. Let's step back in time and see how redlining played out in real life.
One of the most striking examples comes from the 1930s. With the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, imagine the government itself creating maps that explicitly labeled neighborhoods as risky, based solely on the racial makeup of the residents.
Wait, so the government was actually promoting segregation and discrimination?
Sadly, yes. The FHA refused to insure mortgages in these redlined areas, essentially shutting out entire communities from homeownership.
It's just mind-boggling to think that was considered acceptable practice.
It really highlights how deeply ingrained these discriminatory attitudes were. And the effects of those policies are still felt today. In some cases, we can trace the economic disparities between neighborhoods, right back to those red lines drawn decades ago.
It's like a poison that just keeps spreading through generations.
Another chilling example is the legacy of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, and their infamous security maps from the Great Depression era. These maps assessed the risk of lending in different neighborhoods, and guess what played a major role in those assessments?
I think I can guess. Race was the deciding factor, even if they didn't explicitly say it.
Exactly. Neighborhoods with predominantly Black and minority residents were deemed hazardous and shaded red on those maps, resulting in widespread redlining. And what's truly unsettling is that the impact of those maps can still be seen today.
Wait, really? How are maps from the 1930s still affecting us?
Research has shown that those HOLC maps, even though they are decades old, continue to influence lending practices and investment decisions in some cases. The same neighborhoods that were redlined back then are often still struggling with disinvestment, lower property values, and fewer opportunities.
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. The initial act of discrimination just continues to reverberate through time.
Exactly. It shows just how deeply entrenched these patterns of discrimination can be. And it wasn't just government agencies that were engaging in redlining. Private lenders and real estate companies played a significant role as well.
There was a systemic issue, a web of discriminatory practices that spanned both public and private sectors.
Precisely. And it took the courage and determination of individuals and communities to start pushing back and challenging these injustices. That's where those landmark legal cases come into play. They provide a glimpse into the fight for fair housing and the long road toward a more just society.
Okay, let's dive into those legal battles. Which cases stand out as being particularly impactful in the fight against redlining?
One case that really highlights the power of individuals to challenge discrimination is Havens Realty Corp. v. Coleman. Back in 1982, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that individuals and organizations have the right to sue under the Fair Housing Act, even if they weren't the direct target of discrimination.
So, for example, fair housing groups could sue on behalf of entire communities that were being harmed by redlining practices.
Exactly. This ruling empowered communities to challenge things like discriminatory steering, biased appraisals, and other subtle forms of housing discrimination that were previously very difficult to prove.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It really shifted the balance of power and gave people a way to fight back against these insidious practices. Are there any other landmark cases that come to mind?
Two more recent cases, both against Wells Fargo, demonstrate that redlining in new and insidious forms is still very much a 21st century problem.
Oh, right. We touched on these earlier. The lawsuits filed by the cities of Los Angeles and Oakland. Can you remind me what those were about?
Both cities accused Wells Fargo of engaging in a pattern of predatory lending practices that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino borrowers, essentially perpetuating the harms of redlining through different means.
So instead of drawing red lines on maps, they were allegedly using predatory loans to exploit these communities. Can you break down how those lending practices work and why they are considered predatory?
Imagine a family excited about buying their first home, getting steered towards a complex mortgage with hidden fees, ballooning interest rates, and terms that are deliberately confusing. They might not even realize they're being taken advantage of until it's too late.
Sounds like a recipe for financial disaster.
It often is. That's the essence of predatory lending, taking advantage of people's lack of financial literacy or desperation to secure a loan, and often trapping them in debt. And in these cases, both cities argued that Wells Fargo was specifically targeting these predatory products at communities of color, perpetuating the same cycle of disinvestment and inequality that characterized historical redlining.
So they were essentially using different tools to achieve the same discriminatory outcomes. It's infuriating. What was the outcome of those cases? Was Wells Fargo held accountable for their actions?
Thankfully, yes. Both lawsuits resulted in significant settlements, with Wells Fargo agreeing to pay millions of dollars in damages and implement reforms to prevent future discrimination.
It's good to know that justice was served. But I can't help but think about all those families who were caught in those predatory lending schemes. The damage was already done.
You're right. The impact of those practices can be devastating, leading to foreclosures, lost savings, and diminished credit scores. These cases serve as a powerful reminder that the fight for fair and equitable housing is far from over.
It's a sobering thought. Redlining, predatory lending, systemic racism. These issues are all interconnected, creating this complex web of inequality that's difficult to untangle.
You've hit on a crucial point. It's not just about isolated incidents of discrimination. It's about recognizing the deeply rooted systemic nature of these problems and working to dismantle the structures that perpetuate them. But before we delve into those solutions, let's take a step back and recap what we've learned so far. It's been a lot to take in. And I think it's important to pause and reflect on the key takeaways before we move forward.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
The history, the impact, and those legal battles that show this fight for fairness is far from over.
Yeah, and now we're at the point where we need to think about solutions.
Exactly. We've touched on some things individuals can do, but what about those bigger systemic changes? What needs to happen, like at a policy level, to really address this?
Well, systemic problems demand systemic solutions, right? One critical area for policy intervention is housing affordability. If people can't afford to live in certain neighborhoods, it just reinforces those existing patterns of segregation and limits opportunity.
Right. It's like we're stuck in this cycle where past discrimination is shaping the present.
Exactly. We need to break that cycle. And one way to do that is by increasing the supply of affordable housing. This could involve things like government-funded construction projects or incentivizing private developers to build more affordable housing.
So just creating more options that people can actually afford.
Exactly. Another approach is promoting mixed-income housing developments, which can help break down that concentration of poverty that often plagues formerly redlined areas.
Right. I've heard about those. They aim to create more diverse communities, right?
Yeah, the idea is that by integrating different income levels within a single development, you encourage a more inclusive community and potentially foster greater economic opportunity for everyone.
Makes sense. It's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about building communities where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Precisely. But it's not just about building more units either. It's also about ensuring that those units are located in neighborhoods with access to good schools, reliable transportation, and other amenities. We need to be intentional about creating opportunities for upward mobility.
I love that phrase. Intentional about creating opportunities.
It's not enough to just provide housing. It's about fostering a sense of community and belonging. Another key area for policy intervention is strengthening our fair lending laws and enforcement mechanisms. We need to make sure that these laws have teeth and that there are real consequences for discriminatory practices.
It's about holding those institutions accountable, right? Making sure they're actually serving the needs of all communities, not just the privileged few.
Exactly. And we need to be creative in our approaches. For example, exploring alternative credit scoring models that don't disproportionately disadvantage people of color could be a game changer.
Right. I've heard about those models that take into account things like rental history and utility payments. It's a much fairer system that recognizes a broader range of financial behaviors.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that traditional credit scoring systems are often biased against people who have been historically excluded from traditional financial services. By expanding the definition of what constitutes creditworthiness, we can create a more inclusive and equitable financial system.
I'm really encouraged by these ideas. It feels like we're starting to really chip away at the foundation of these systemic problems.
We're making progress, but it's a long game. And it's not just about policy changes either. We also need to invest in community development initiatives that empower residents of formerly redlined neighborhoods.
So things like job training programs, support with small businesses, and improvements to infrastructure and public amenities.
Exactly. We need to create pathways for economic empowerment and community revitalization. It's about equipping people with the tools and resources they need to succeed, not just offering temporary Band-Aid solutions.
It's about investing in people, not just buildings.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the inherent worth and potential of every individual, regardless of their zip code or background.
That's a powerful message to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into redlining, what's like the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will carry with them?
I think the main takeaway is that redlining may be a historical practice, but its legacy continues to shape our communities in really profound ways. We need to be aware of those enduring impacts and work collectively to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality.
It's about recognizing that this fight for justice and equity is ongoing and requires a sustained effort from all of us.
Exactly. It's a call to action for each of us to examine our own roles in perpetuating or challenging these systems of inequality.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. These are conversations we need to keep having.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into redlining. We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more about the issues impacting your own communities. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can create a more just and equitable world. Until next time, keep diving deep.